Hello, welcome to McMay's Academy. Today, we'll be talking about game theory, the basics of game theory. As abstract as it can be, today we'll go through the course and make it more simplified. And that's Game Theory 101. As part of the discussion, we'll be talking about the concept of games theory, and that would include the basic concepts that you need to understand to set us up for the whole presentation. And then we'll be talking about a couple of games: the Prisoner's Dilemma, the Battle of Sexes, talk about much of the mixed strategies, what we know about the sequential games, repeated games, and a whole lot of others. And so this tutorial will be broken into series. This is the first part, which will be dealing with the concept of game theory for us to appreciate the framework and how to proceed from there. So let's jump into it and let's get going. Now, when we talk about game theory with the whole lessons is going to be based from the materials prepared by Mas-Collel et al. 1995, Microeconomics. Yeah, these are slides prepared by myself and colleagues, Luis, Faustina, Macarius, PhD students in the University of Ghana. So basically, that's our source material of Mas-Collel et al. 1995. Good. So just jumping into it, game theory is a mathematical framework. We want to understand how individuals, how nations, how firms, strategize their actions and inactions. And so we are going to implement this strategic relationship with mathematical framework. And so representing these interactions in a mathematical framework is what we call the game theory. And the process where each player, yes, as we go forward, I'll introduce to it, the process where parties of the framework choose to act or not to act in that respect is the game that is being played. Now, of course, we know games are played between players. And so the context of game theory, the players are the participants or the people which are making the decisions in the game. Okay, so whether or not to sleep is the game we are going to play. Okay, now these players, like I said, could be individuals, they could be firms, and they could be anything else, so long as there's going to be a strategic interaction between these partners, then that activity is a game, which we are going to formulate that relationship with a mathematical framework. And that's the concept of game theory. Game theory, as it is, has several applications. Individuals, talk of families. We can also talk about nations. We can have strategic relationships between firms, right? So as we delve on, we're going to introduce ourselves to all these for us to understand. All right. Now, going on from there, then we want to talk about strategies. Strategies are a set of choices or decisions that the player makes. Okay, so let's take example. We have two players, two participants of a game. Now, the game is such that there is an exams we need to write, and it's going to be played between two players called Seth and Isaac. Now, Seth has two strategies, either to learn for the exams or not to learn for the exams. So Seth's strategies are A, either study for the test or B, not to study for the test. Now, any strategy as simple as this is what you call a simple strategy. So Isaac could also have a strategy to play. Okay, I would also not study for the test. Okay, I will study for the test. So each player has two strategies. So a strategy that is as simple as this, whether or not to make a current decision, not based upon past experiences or future expectations, such a strategy will be called a simple strategy. Good. If that was a simple strategy, then there would also be a complex strategy. And this is clearly the case where we have an individual deciding to take a path today based on previous experiences. And so Seth could decide to study for the test. Why? Because Isaac didn't study for the test yesterday. So because Isaac didn't study for the test yesterday, Seth is deciding to study for the test today. And so Seth's decision today is based on yesterday's strategy played by Isaac. That means Seth's decision to study for the test today is a complex strategy. Now, Seth could also decide to study for the exam because tomorrow he wouldn't study for the exam, or tomorrow Isaac will be the one to study for the exam. In that sense, Seth is making the decision today based on a strategy that Isaac will play tomorrow. And that makes Seth's decision to study today a complex strategy. So let's take another example for complex strategy for Isaac. Isaac would say that I will only contribute in the last phase if Seth works hard in the first phase. Otherwise, he's not willing to help. All right, so these are complex interactions, strategies that individuals play among themselves, firms play among themselves, and also even nations play among themselves. Take a typical example, real-world example of a game theory that nations play. Let me make this a typical example with regard to the United States and the Soviet Union. That's during the Cold War and then during the nuclear arms race. That's a typical example of one type of game you'll be treating called the prisoner's dilemma. Now, in the Cold War application of the prisoner's dilemma, one example of the game, we see that if the United States and the Soviet Union had chosen to disarm and avoid nuclear armaments, they would have saved enough resources and reduced global threats significantly. But the problem is that if one disarmed and the other doesn't disarm, the one which does not disarm gains an advantage. Strategic advantage, of course. So, as it were, would the Soviet Union disarm and leave the United States with a greater strategic advantage? Would the United States disarm and leave the Soviet Union with greater strategic disadvantage? So what happens is that because both trust not each other, they end up producing the arms. And that increases costs, increases global threats, security threats in that regard. And that is a suboptimal decision. Okay, so you can see games being played out at the national level, international diplomacy, way rooted into game theory. So relax and let's get through these types of games for you to appreciate international relations and how to deal with firms and individuals as well. Right, so regarding the basic concept, we've talked about game theory, we've talked about the players, we've also talked about the strategies, which could either be simple strategy or a complex strategy. Now, at the end of the game, at the end of taking your strategies, you will begin to earn results. And that results is going to be called payoff. All right. But the combination of all strategies, all the decisions you make from yesterday, today, we put all those strategies together and we call them strategy profile. So a strategy profile is the list of all strategies you have at your advantage. So let's take players 2 and player 1 and player 2. For instance, if S1, that is the strategy for player 1, and S2 are the set of strategies open for player 1 and player 2, then in simple notation, SI is open for all players. So in N notations, we have SI, which means that strategies by player 1, player 2, player 3, player 4, to whatever strategies that we could have. Now, each strategy that a player plays has to be part or a member of the strategy set available to that player. And so with the Seth example, whether to study for the exam or not to study for the exam, Seth's strategy profile will be study, not to study. And so an example also will be with the US and the Soviet Union regarding the arms race. The strategies available is to disarm, not to disarm. Okay. So let's go ahead. Like I said, so after you've played your strategies, disarm, and player 2 also disarms, the payoffs, the utility that you earn, that is what we call the payoff. That's the results. So the payoff is the final returns at the conclusion of the game. So at the end of both players playing their strategies, whatever returns accruing to each parties become the payoff. So at the end of the game, each player's payoff would depend on the strategy the other player also played. And so you would see that the payoff U1 is a function of S1 and S2, which means the payoff to player 1 will depend on the strategy that player 1 plays, and that's also played by player 2. Again, player 2's payoff, which is U2, would also be based on the strategy player 2 played, given the strategy of player 1. And so each player's strategy will be a function of whatever strategy the other player also played. With this, we come to the end of the basic concepts of game theory, the very understanding we need. In the next section of the discourse, we'll be talking about the types of games, which is the Prisoner's Dilemma, Battle of Sexes, 3 Companies, amongst others. So see you in our next video as we talk about game theory.